All right, so welcome back to the Becoming a Management Scientist pod. This is going to be episode 5, but it's chapter 3. And in this chapter, we're going to talk about how being a victim of a circumstance isn't a character flaw. And what this podcast is going to be about is really about poverty and homelessness, and the kind of how cities are kind of trying to work with lessening the effects of homelessness, with government housing, etc. And what another country has actually done, which was an amazing idea. And the whole thought process behind this podcast, the reason why I decided to do it was because the idea was actually brought to me by my good friend Renee, who will hopefully be on maybe the next week's podcast or maybe one after that. But she actually mentioned that this was, an episode that I should probably do, talking about homelessness and poverty. And I'll get into what the other country has done, which was what really sparked the idea. And it's such a good idea. And I think it could very easily be initiated here in the States. I think it would really just be coordinating between different corporations and different nonprofits, as well as like the local governments. It could be a state and federal thing as well, but it's more on the local government side. So I'm just going to get into a few facts about homelessness, like where the statistics are, where it's the worst, and just kind of what has been done, whether it be good or bad, and what I think could be done, which is something else. Not only do I want to do, a nonprofit to help out recovering addicts, but this is something that I would really like to see happen here too. And it's just a matter of bringing it to the attention of the, like the city manager, or, really like the zoning commission, because they would have to be the ones to figure out what plots of land and etc. So to get into this, the reason I titled it A Victim of Circumstance is not a character flaw is because I had mentioned on a previous podcast that I watched this podcast. It was a documentary, a short little snippet of a documentary, where a lady from West Virginia had said that, being poor or poverty or homelessness is not a character flaw. It's just you're a victim of the circumstance that you're in. And I think that's really, it's really rings true that, for some people, it's not their fault that they've lost their home. It's not their fault that they don't have a livable income. It's really just, where they're from, the area that they're from, family background, educational background, health issues, all of that. And it's stuff that I'll get into as I go through some of these statistics. So going through this and trying to research everything, there are roughly a little over 500,000 people in the US that are homeless, which in comparison to the actual population of the US, it doesn't seem like a huge amount, but that is still a very large amount of people who are living on the streets who are homeless. And this is just who's been accounted for. There are people that are probably, not accounted for in this, like youths that aren't accounted for in this. And so the number could be much higher. And when I was looking up, there's a map that shows you the percentage, per how many people per 10,000 people. And New York and Hawaii had the highest percentage per 10,000. New York was 46.9 per 10,000, and Hawaii was 45.6. New York didn't necessarily shock me because of how large New York is and how expensive New York is. Hawaii kind of shocked me a little bit more just because of how small the island is, although I knew that Hawaii is a very expensive place to live. I didn't realize that it was the home that had such a very large homeless population. And as far as the states that have the largest homeless populations, it's New York and California, which, they have the most, they have the largest population out of the United States. So it's obvious that they're going to have a marginally larger population of homeless. What was a little bit more surprising to me is where the pockets of large amounts of homelessness was. It sort of shocked me, but I guess in a way it's not too surprising for maybe some people. But the Southwest and the West Coast had a very large, had some of the highest amounts, along with New York and New England. So like Massachusetts and Pennsylvania. The places that had the least was actually the Midwest. They had the least amount, and granted that's, they have a much sparser population, and I don't want to say that it's the cost of living is cheaper there, but it could be factors like that. It could be factors of, they've done their research and they've done the work, and places in the Midwest have a lot more open land, so they may be able to build places for people to live that are affordable. So that could be the reason why the Midwest is, has the smallest contingency of homeless. So some of the reasons, what the main reasons are for people losing their home or being homeless, obviously poverty is the number one reason. Inadequate pay, unemployment, it all kind of goes hand in hand. Another one is the lack of affordable housing. So for people who even have a job that maybe are only making minimum wage or a little over minimum wage, have a lack of affordable housing. And, I'm not 100% on the way how they dole out Section 8 and affordable housing, but I know that it's there are certain, restrictions and things you have to meet to actually be afforded, or actually not be afforded, but actually be able to get the housing. And typically it goes first to single mothers and the elderly, which it should go to. Not that I'm saying that, single persons without, children don't deserve a place to live. But when it comes to someone who has children, or someone who is in their older years and really, can't withstand the elements, then I think that they should be the first to receive, the vouchers for affordable housing. But it's also a reflection of, like I said, the local government who hasn't maybe put enough into the budget for more affordable housing. That really kind of needs to step their game up too. So, but those are some of the things. There's also things like domestic violence, mental health issues, addiction, and lack of affordable healthcare was also one of the reasons. And by lack of affordable healthcare, I mean, like, if someone has had to go to the doctor, X amount of times, and they've had their insurance cut and they've had to make all these payments, and they can end up losing the money that they have for their rent. And so therefore they're out of place to live. And really a huge reason why poverty and even the lack of, or the lack of affordable healthcare as part of it, is the pay scale in the US is skewed. This whole minimum wage is enough to let somebody live off of is ridiculous. No one can live off of what the minimum wage is. It's like $8 an hour. There is no one can live off of that. And I know people think, well, they should just get better jobs. Well, some of them, lack the resources to get a better job. Some of them lack education to get a better job. And again, it's through no fault of their own. It just may be the area that they live in. There are some rural areas in all of the US that don't have the employment opportunities that larger cities or larger states have. And so their only option is to work, at places that maybe only offer minimum wage or just over minimum wage. And when you tally it up, minimum wage is not enough to help somebody pay their rent, not enough to get them food, not enough if they have to have transportation to and from work. It's not enough to pay their utilities. And a lot of them, because they have a job or a steady job, can't get on government assistance programs either because they make too much. So that is a huge issue. And that was all part of what is causing the homelessness in America. And it's really, really something that, the local, like I said, it's local government, but it could go up to state and federal. It's really something that they need to get kind of more of a handle on. And then, I went into some detail, not a whole lot of detail, but some detail about what is currently being done on both the positive and negative side. The current solutions that they have, which is the positive, is, housing, which again, there are criteria that have to be met, and not everyone is going to be able to get into housing right away. There are wait lists there, because there's not enough of it. There are people that are, while waiting to get into affordable housing, are still either having to live out of their car if they're lucky enough to have a car, or they are living on the street. And when I say lucky enough to have a car, they should still be able to have a house. Like, no one should have to. I mean, there are people who choose to live out of their car, and that's all well and good. But for the people who don't choose to, and it's really becoming a hardship, they should be entitled to some housing. It's, kind of a basic human right to be able to get yourself out of the elements. Like, no one should have to suffer through that. Another one was to integrate healthcare, and whether that means having maybe not necessarily universal healthcare, although I would be a big proponent for that. But having maybe more, I know Tennessee has TennCare, but it's mostly for kids, but having something like that for people who are who either don't have a steady source of income, or who have, very little income coming in, and their job maybe doesn't offer benefits, or they can't afford the benefits through their job. So, because that's what people don't understand. They're like, well, they can just get insurance through their job. Okay, most insurances through your job, depending on where you work, range anywhere from $40 to $80 a paycheck. When you make minimum wage, you can't afford anywhere from $80 to $160 every month to come out. You can't. So there needs to be some sort of subsidiary program for that. Again, like I said, Tennessee has TennCare that is for, kids of parents who don't make enough money, but they need something for, single people or older people that aren't on Medicare yet, who need healthcare but can't afford it. Another one was to build career pathways, which this is actually a really good idea. I know a lot of local governments have ties in with, the unemployment office, and they offer, services to help get people placement. But I think what they're talking about in these career pathways is maybe offering to a trade school type program where somebody could get paid while they're learning, but could learn a trade, and then be placed in a job as soon as it's done, which would be a phenomenal idea, especially if it's someone that's not, either doesn't want to go back to school for a certain degree, or doesn't have the opportunity to go to school, or, wants to fast track getting into a certain job. I think having, local or state run programs for people to go through, like a trade school with like guaranteed job placement, is a great idea. Also doing something, it's very similar to like what Job Corps does for teenagers up into like young adults. Doing something like that for, adults who've either been, let go or have tried to retire but don't make enough in their retirement and learn something, want to do something smaller, versus trying to get everybody into the service industry, which we all know does not pay enough. But I think having that and having that sort of, again, having almost like a guaranteed job placement after you're done with it, would help alleviate a lot of the homelessness and a lot of poverty. Another one was to foster the education connection, which would be something very similar to that too. I know a lot of states have started doing 2 free years at like a technical school, again, which I think is pretty amazing, because you can go and get all your gen ed requirements out of the way for 2 years and not have to worry about, being in debt when you go to get the rest of your bachelor's. Or, if you just want an associate's, like that's awesome. Like go that 2 years, do it for free. That way you're not, going in debt trying to take out student loans like the rest of us. Which is a whole nother episode of the podcast. Another thing was to strengthen crisis response. What local and sometimes state governments do is they have, I think the federal government even has it as crisis response teams. That's not just for like natural disasters. That was something they did for COVID. But it's also something like I know that they have a crisis response team for like the opioid epidemic and stuff, and different drug response teams. So they're trying to strengthen this to help when there is a large population of homeless, to help deal with that, especially in states that have more inclement weather. So people aren't out on the streets during, whether it be like tropical storms or whether it be, blizzards or tornadoes, etc. So they're trying to strengthen that, which is, some states it worked great for COVID. Some states really need to like get on the ball, but it's definitely something that needs to work for, helping deal with people having lack of housing. And another one was to reduce criminal justice involvement, which means that it's not up to the police to, move homeless out of the area or arrest them for whatever reason. I also have this one in a negative. So when I go into the negatives, I'll go into more about having criminal justice involvement in this situation. But yeah, reducing their involvement with, dealing one-on-one with the homeless. The other two were one was to build partnerships with like nonprofits, like kind of like Habitat for Humanity and stuff like that. But another was to prevent homelessness. But I think that just kind of, could be a very unrealistic expectation, because there could always be someone that, suddenly loses their job and then is not able to pay for their housing. But so that, that's kind of like a pipe dream to prevent homelessness. But I think, all of these things, kind of add into preventing homelessness, just kind of blanketed in that. But to actually just to blatantly say we're going to prevent homelessness is kind of, it's like a unicorn. It's, it's very unlikely that it's ever going to happen to such a high degree. So now I'll get into some of the negatives, which is, cities taking a more punishment style approach versus like positive reinforcement and things like that. So in a punishment style approach, most of you I know probably have seen caught different like in front of storefronts or on certain sidewalks. They're called spikes, but it's just raised places so that homeless people will be very uncomfortable when they try to lay down. I know that there are some that will, if they have the means, they'll get cardboard boxes and they'll try to do it anyway. But a lot of cities have tried to start setting up spikes along the concrete, so they're not able to lay down anywhere in like the city vicinity, so people can't see it. They're trying to take a more out of sight, out of mind kind of approach to it. Another thing that they'll do is they'll put barriers on park benches, so that there's no way for them to lay. So the park benches, instead of the park bench being this long, it's now like this long, because there's the barriers between it, so they can't lay down on it. Because they don't necessarily want to lay on the cold hard ground. If they're up off of the bench, on a bench, at least they have some, level of support to them besides, just the ground. And then another one, this will be the criminal justice portion of it. What they'll do is, they'll continue to wake them up and make them move. They'll get them out of the area. There's times where they'll arrest them for no reason. However, in saying they'll arrest them for no reason, there are some cities, especially in places like, New York, Maine, Minnesota, anywhere where it gets so cold, officers will actually go, and I use this in quotes, they'll arrest the people that are homeless, but it's actually because they're giving them a place to stay for the night out of the cold. They can only hold them for 24 hours because they're not actually pressing charges and they're not actually putting it on their arrest record. So they can't hold them. And a lot of the homeless people know that this is what's happening, so they just go along with it because A, they get meals, and B, they have a place to sleep that's not outside in the elements. I think this is getting cracked down on because they can't actually, you can't hold somebody if there's no charges being pressed. And I don't know if they actually do or not, and maybe it just gets expunged, or the people who are homeless are okay with having that one arrest or two arrests because they know they're going to get out of the cold for a little bit. But I think they're starting to crack down on being able to do that, which is part of that, getting a criminal justice element out of helping with homelessness. So that's the only real one positive about criminal justice being involved in this, is that those police forces that were actually doing it to help save life, basically, because, in places where it gets down to, even if it gets down below freezing, like 20 degrees plus, if these people don't have adequate, clothing or adequate sleeping bags or a place to sleep that'll keep the wind off of them, this is, or if it's raining or snowing, a place to keep them dry, the police actually arresting them and taking them someplace where they can eat and sleep and be warm, is, I guess they're willing to trade that, maybe having a small record, for that. So that actually brings me into kind of what this other country, which is Germany, actually, what Germany has done to help with the homelessness problem is they have actually set up weatherproof pods that are either metal or they're wooden, but they are weatherproof and they are solar powered. And it is either a single use, or there might be ones that are big enough for 2 people, a single use pod, and it is actually hooked up to a, I guess like not really a ring camera, but almost like a sensor that will allow social workers to know when a person is using it. So for 2 reasons, it'll let them know when somebody's using it. So after they're done, they can go and clean it. And it will also allow them to go and speak to the person to see if they need any sort of resources. And again, these are, I guess they've been, I don't know exactly how, like, I guess what we consider nonprofits would work in Germany, or if it was like state funded, how they got the materials for it. But it's just little like pods big enough for people to sleep in. They're not standing upright. They're actually like laying down or on a curve. They're solar powered. So if the people actually have electronics, they are able to charge them. And I guess it heats it up too, but they're completely weatherproof. And it's such a great system because, again, not only is it allowing somebody to be out of the elements and have a nice place to sleep, but it's also allowing social workers to come and speak to a person to maybe get them on the right track to get employment or to get like housing. And I think that is something that is so able to be done in the US, because you could partner with nonprofits like Habitat for Humanity. You could reach out to see if you could get donations for the materials. You could work with the local government to get plots of land that are considered public land, but that would be in an area where my friend actually suggested like down near the river. That way they could bathe. If it's in the summer, they could bathe in the river and then have a nice place to sleep. They could wash their clothes if they needed to. But having it set up to where a social worker could come and could, A, they're going to clean up afterwards, but B, they could come in and, say, hey, is there anything that you need? Is there something that I can do to help get you into a more permanent situation? And again, I think it's genius, because if you're getting a lot of the materials donated, if the plots of land are already on public land that's not designated as like a park or, really a super public area, it gets it out of the way. They're not sleeping in storefronts. They're not sleeping on benches. You're not having to have police run them off because they're somewhere where they shouldn't be. It's, if the local and state government would work together to designate out these little plots of land, then private donors or, nonprofits could get together and get the materials together and could build these weatherproof, little pods for fairly cheap. I'm not going to say they're completely cheap because they are also solar powered, but could build them for fairly cheap. And then, get either volunteer social workers, or social workers who want to volunteer their time, which they probably don't have a ton of time, but you could put people on staff with the government. That's one of their sole responsibilities, is to go through and check out these places and see if they need help, especially if it's, like unfortunately a domestic violence situation. Getting, a woman or even a man who's been in a domestic violence situation, or a member of the LGBTQ community who's been in a domestic violence situation, getting them the help that they need to get them away from the person kind of permanently, but also to get them in a more permanent situation. And when she brought this idea up to me, I was like, that's so awesome. And I went online and I looked it up, and I looked up, what they looked like, just to see if it was, thinking maybe it was like a tarp with, a metal structure, but like a tarp, but no, they're actually like solidly built structures. And They have them, you know, they're not placed super close together, but they are kind of all in a same area. And again, it would just mean if there is a place designated as public land that's not really used as a public park or a wildlife reserve, but would be able to be used for this, you could spread them out fairly, you know, far apart so they have enough privacy. But it's, you know, especially in places like, you know, for the homeless in Alaska, all through the north, all through the, you know, upper parts of the Midwest where it gets really cold, places in the South where it gets really, really hot, or it gets, you know, it storms a lot. You know, like Southwest, the same thing where it gets dry and arid and hot. You know, you can put these places, you know, like to where they're weatherproof. I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have like a heater or an air conditioner, although you could if it's solar powered. But just something to be comfortable enough to get them out of, you know, the elements, and to get them off of street corners, to get them off of, you know, like stores' door fronts. Because I know living here in Charleston, there's, I work on a main strip on the peninsula, and every night, most all of the shops close around like 6 or 7. So it's fairly early, but I know that I've been walking back to the garage that I park in, and there's been 2 or 3 sleeping, you know, bundled up in comforters, sleeping right outside the doorstep. And it's, you know, typically the same people over and over, but it's because they don't really have anywhere else to go. So something like that is, you know, like needed here. It's needed just about everywhere, because I know where I'm from in Tennessee, one of the cities actually has put in some of those more harsh measures where they've put spikes on the concrete, and they've, you know, put the borders up in the middle of the park benches so they can't sleep there, or, you know, they've run people off if they've been trying to sleep on the ground somewhere in a public area. And this is a really, really good solution. And it's definitely something that, you know, I mean, geez, I would say if the federal government can get a hold of it, but really it would be up to the states, because it's going to be the states that would have to, the states and the local government that would have to designate out where these different, you know, pods would go. But it's such a brilliant idea. It really, really is. And especially having it hooked up to this system where, you know, somebody can come in, and this is really where you could get this, you know, working with employment services, working on finding things like the affordable housing, or, you know, getting them into housing, or getting the process started. And it wouldn't be someplace, you know, they couldn't permanently stay in it, but they could move to different ones. And, you know, it's not ever to kick anyone out of them. And it's not, you know, this isn't like some incentive for people to stay homeless, because obviously it's just a little sleeping pod. It's not an incentive for someone to stay homeless, because I don't think anyone really wants to stay homeless. But it is a step in the right direction to get them, A, get them out of the elements, and B, get them hooked up with someone who can, you know, help them get into, again, a more permanent situation. So this is something that I, you know, I had always had this thought about working with, you know, addicts and, you know, mental health issues, and working with the LGBTQ community. But I had never really thought about starting something up like this for homelessness. And, you know, again, when she told me this, I was like, that's brilliant. That is, they have, you know, hit it out of the ballpark with that one. So good for Germany. But so that is pretty much where this podcast was going. Over the next few, I will probably not do one the week of Christmas. And we'll start up kind of at the beginning of the year. Hopefully the next podcast will be with my good friend Renee, and that one will probably be, we'll definitely have a trigger warning, be a little bit more explicit, because we are going to talk about, self-harm and certain, mental illness issues and addiction. And then probably closer to the new year, I'm going to start the chapters on religion and science and LGBTQ and stuff like that. And we'll maybe have a few smaller casts with, some other people that can be a little bit more fun. I'm also going to do one on, the gender construct and like self-love and, this whole body, how people have been forced into body dysmorphia because of this unrealistic expectation of what people should look the way they should look, or some people should look this way or people should look that way. And we'll probably have some people on for that one as well. Some sensitive topics, obviously I will, like I said, I'll give it in the very beginning, or we'll write it in the description so we know what we're talking about before you actually listen. But there are going to be some good ones coming up. So I will see you guys next time.